And welcome to another one of these live sessions on YouTube. If you are watching, it's probably because you are taking a course that is taught by Dr. R.C. Sproul, but which I'm moderating, a course that is on justification by faith alone, that precious doctrine that's at the very heart and soul of the Christian faith. And of course, we're studying this in the lead up to the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, which will be celebrated next year in 2017. That will mark 500 years since Martin Luther took his famous action of nailing his theses to the door of that cathedral in Wittenberg. And so week by week, we've been learning about this doctrine. R.C. Sproul has been leading us through it. And then I've been doing these sessions on YouTube to answer some of your questions. And every other week, I've been bringing in an expert to speak to us about these things, to answer some of the most pressing and some of the most difficult questions. And this week, it's a joy to welcome Dr. Derek Thomas as my guest. He is Senior Minister of First Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina. He is Dean of the Doctor of Ministry program at Ligonier Academy. And he's the author of quite a lot of books, one of which I was referencing today, actually, in sermon preparation, one of his commentaries. But he's also written a book on Romans itself called How the Gospel Brings Us All the Way Home. So Dr. Thomas, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome whoever it is who's out there in this hanging out on this Google Hangout, and it's a joy to be with you.
Good. What a strange world where you can sit in South Carolina in your home office. I can sit in Toronto in my home office, and we can be joined by people all around the world who are interested in justification of all things. So over the last few weeks, we've had people ask a number of questions. We've saved up some of them for you, but most of these have to do with this week's lesson where Dr. Sproul taught about the consequences of justification. And one of the questions that came up related to Romans 5, verse 1. And the idea that the first consequence of justification, at least the first one that Dr. Sproul highlights, is peace with God. We're no longer at enmity with God. Instead, we have peace with God. And then Frank asked this question. If I understand it, well, let me tell you the question. He says, what does never having experienced the fear of God's wrath indicate? So maybe he's getting at this. What does it mean for someone to have peace with God who's never consciously experienced God's wrath? So I'm thinking there maybe of children who are raised in the church. They have had a privileged upbringing in middle-class Canada or middle-class America. They've always been in a church. They don't have this conscious experience of God's wrath. So what does it mean for them that they have peace with God? How should that sing in their souls?
Yeah, this is a really interesting and important question. And it's one, in fact, that I think that the Westminster Confession actually anticipates, because we can turn justification by faith around because we have a predisposition to become legalists. I think it's an Adamic gene within us, and we can actually turn justification by faith into something that is justification by the experience of faith. And so the Westminster Confession, is very opening statement on justification, says that we're justified by faith alone in Christ alone, and not for anything wrought in us or by us. And that subtle distinction between in us and by us, we understand that we're not justified by something that we do, but we can, as evangelicals especially, we can turn it around and say, no, but we're justified by the quality of our faith, or the experience of our faith, or the experience of things that lead to faith, like the experience of conviction of sin, or the experience of, and Frank mentioned, whoever Frank is, Frank mentioned the wrath. I guess you say wrath too in Canada, but the wrath of God. It's the issue of, do you make Saul of Tarsus the model for what experiencing justification by faith is like? So a sudden dramatic conversion, a period where he is under conviction for days or weeks, or or for that matter, the experience of Martin Luther, since we're on the cusp of the 500th anniversary of his nailing of those 95 theses to the Wittenberg church door. Going through perhaps even years of anguish of soul and fearing the wrath of God, so that I'm only justified if I've passed through all of these stages. So before long, you're into an area that we sometimes refer to as preparationism. So you have to have a John Bunyan experience of conversion, where you go through months and years of conviction before that justification becomes valid. So you're basically saying, I'm justified by my experience. And all of a sudden, that experience has become a work. It's become something that you do. And that's why, as Dr. Sproul says so often, that what at the heart of the Reformation is, and at the heart of Martin Luther, is that salvation is extra nos. It is outside of me, and outside of my experience too. So that justification is a forensic declaration of God to those who trust in Christ alone for salvation, and faith is just the instrument, the medium through which that objective justification comes. So it's a very important question, and one I think that those of us in the Reformed world with an experiential dimension to our faith that is important can fall into a kind of trap of turning this glorious doctrine of justification into, in fact, something that is a justification by works, or a justification by experience.
Yeah, excellent. There's another question that maybe is a bit related to that one, about the implications of justification and about peace with God. And a few people ask questions that essentially seem to say something like, I've been given peace with God. The other people in my church have been given peace with God. Why don't we have peace with one another? Shared peace with God, we would think, would lead to shared peace within the local church. But then Catherine asks, do you have advice on how we can maintain the peace of the church, especially the local congregation, where there seem to be some who appear to be true brothers and sisters in Christ who cause arguments or encourage a spirit of discontentment? Or Phyllis, what does it mean if you don't love a fellow justified believer? So I wonder if you can guide us a little bit on there. Why doesn't love or peace with God work out all the time, peace between believers?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. It reminds me of, and I may get the details wrong here, but it reminds me of a Peanuts cartoon where Lucy and Linus are having a conversation, and I think it's Lucy who says to Linus, you could never be a doctor, and he says, why? And she says, because you don't love mankind. And he says, I love mankind, it's people I can't stand. And there's a take on that, I think, in a book called The Gospel of Peanuts, or Peanuts and the Gospel, or The Gospel According to Peanuts, where it goes something like this: I love church, it's just people I don't like. Yeah. And there's such an amount of truth in that statement that it almost hurts, because all of us have an experience of church and of church life where there are certain individuals that we just don't like. Now, let me back up to the issue of loving our brothers and sisters, and of course that's a command. By this, you will know that you're 1 John, that you're a Christian, that you pass from death to life, that you love the brothers. And so we're commanded to love one another. I do think that the concept, first of all, of friendship is a biblical concept, that you're to love every Christian, everyone who's justified, but there are people that you love in a special way, in a friendship way, in the four loves of C.S. Lewis and Philadelphia, the love between friends. I think you see that in Jesus and the three disciples, and Jesus and John especially, and there seems to be a bond of friendship. So I don't think it's wrong to be closer to some Christians than to others. I find it interesting that in Romans 12, I'm guessing verse 18, somewhere halfway through Romans 12, Paul says, if it is possible, live at peace with all men. And I think he's referring to church as well as perhaps to civil society, but to church too, because there are believers who are difficult, and there are believers with really cranky personalities, and they're warped by sin in a way that makes them stand out, perhaps. And so none of that should lessen the command and the imperative on our part. We should do our utmost to try and love. And I think there's a difference between loving someone and liking someone. I can love someone that I don't especially like, in the sense that we have very little in common, different personality, different interests, different hobbies, and so on. Always remember from Augustine and Calvin that the three most important words for the Christian life are humility, 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 and that the fault may lie in us and not in them.
Yeah.
Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but emptied himself, made himself of no reputation. So that is a problem in our relationship with other Christians, even especially Christians that we perhaps don't like, that we don't share similar interests with, or life has so harmed them that they still reveal some of the effects of sin in a very blatant way. But always remember that the fault may also lie with us.
Right. Yeah, we always consider ourselves so easy to love and consider others so difficult to love. So that's always the human tendency. I want to ask a question then about justification. And Romans 4:25 speaks about Jesus being raised again for our justification. Romans 5 verse 9 speaks about being justified by the blood of Christ. And so Randall is wondering, are we justified by Christ's resurrection, or are we justified by his blood? How do the two sides of justification relate to each other?
Yes, that's a really interesting question too. And the answer is yes. Because I think that justification is faith in Christ alone, and the whole Christ. It's faith in Christ from his conception to his birth, to his life, to his obedience, to his giving of himself on the cross in death, which is the reference to blood in chapter 5 and verse 9. But it's also, the Jesus that we believe in is not a dead Jesus. He's not simply the Jesus who died on the cross, but he's a Jesus who died and was buried, and on the third day rose again and ascended into heaven. So Paul, when he thinks about the contours of our relationship with Christ, our union with Christ, which is the result of justification, talks about it in Romans 6, for example, as a dynamic that involves death and resurrection, of dying and coming to life. So Yes, Jesus had to die. He had to shed his blood. The wages of sin is death. So Jesus had to die as our sin bearer and substitute. But the vindication that God had accepted that offering as a substitutionary offering on our behalf was the resurrection. So it's believing into Christ, but the whole Christ, the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the Christ who is in fact sitting as sovereign Lord on the throne of the universe. So the active and passive obedience of Christ, the whole life of Christ, death and resurrection. And I think the answer is yes.
Yes. Great. Yeah. And I think I've read some pretty cute attempts to subdivide the life and death and resurrection of Christ into this is exactly what his life accomplished. This is exactly what his death accomplished. This is exactly what his resurrection accomplished. And, there may be some value in doing that, but in the end, as you say, it's the whole Christ. The whole Christ accomplished all that Christ accomplished, right? So we don't.
Right. And I think that the central dynamic for Paul is en Christo, believing in Christ, and the preposition in Christ is a preposition that can mean into Christ, and into the whole Christ, and not just the Christ on the cross, but the entirety of Christ.
Right.
And that's what we get in our resultant union with Christ.